My name is Miller. I just turned 67 last month. My only son, Harold, was my whole world after I lost my wife to cancer. We built our tech company together from nothing. When Harold died in that plane crash, I thought nothing could hurt more until his wife, Stephanie, showed her true colors. The day she inherited $55 million in our family home, she looked me in the eyes and said words I never thought I would hear. Before I tell you about the most painful betrayal of my life, let me know where you are watching from. Drop a comment and subscribe to hear stories that will remind you that justice sometimes comes when you least expect it. Family has always meant everything to me. After my wife, Margaret, passed away from breast cancer when Harold was just 10 years old, it was just the two of us against the world. I poured everything I had into raising him right and building our future. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs of Chicago back then. I remember those early mornings, making him breakfast before school, checking his homework at night, and trying my best to be both mother and father. I started our technology company, Miller Innovations, from our garage with just $8,000 I had saved. We specialized in security software, and for the first 5 years, it was a constant struggle to keep the lights on. Harold would come to the garage after school, doing his homework at a small desk I had set up for him while I worked on code late into the night. He was such a bright kid, always asking questions about the business, absorbing everything like a sponge. As Harold grew, so did our company. By the time he was in high school, Miller Innovations had 30 employees and had moved into a real office building. Harold showed an incredible aptitude for both technology and business strategy. He got accepted to MIT on a partial scholarship, and I worked even harder to make sure I could cover the rest of his expenses without him needing loans. Those college years were tough with him away, but I was so proud watching him flourish. He graduated summa cum laude with dual degrees in computer science and business administration. When he told me he wanted to come work at Miller Innovations rather than take offers from Silicon Valley giants, I felt my heart might burst with pride. Harold brought fresh ideas and energy to the company. Within 3 years of him joining, we had expanded internationally, and our valuation had reached $70 million. He was innovative, but also had a natural charm that made clients and employees alike gravitate toward him. Our relationship evolved from father and son to true business partners, though I never stopped seeing him as my little boy in some ways. It was at our annual company gala 5 years ago that Harold met Stephanie. She worked for one of our partner marketing firms and was there representing her company. I remember the moment clearly. Harold stopped mid-conversation when she walked in wearing a sleek red dress. He literally walked away from the CEO of a major distribution company to introduce himself to her. Stephanie was undeniably beautiful, with long dark hair, green eyes, and a smile that lit up a room. She was smart too, articulate and knowledgeable about our industry. At first, I was impressed with how she carried herself. She seemed ambitious, driven, and appeared to genuinely care for Harold. Their courtship was whirlwind fast. Within 6 months, Harold told me he was going to propose. I was happy for him, but suggested they might take more time to know each other. He laughed and said, "Dad, when you know, you know. Mom would have understood that, and how could I argue with that?" The engagement party was the first time I noticed something that made me uncomfortable. Stephanie was charming and warm with everyone in public settings, but during a quiet moment in the kitchen, I overheard her snapping harshly at a catering staff member who had spilled something minor. The contrast between her public face and that private moment gave me pause, but I brushed it aside. Everyone has bad moments, right? Harold wanted a big wedding, and I was happy to foot the bill. 200 guests, top venue in Chicago, 5-course meal, everything first class. Stephanie seemed more concerned with the impression the wedding would make than the meaning behind it. She often talked about which executives would be there, how the wedding would look on social media, rather than the commitment they were making. But Harold was so happy, I kept my concerns to myself. After the wedding, I began noticing subtle changes. Stephanie became less warm toward me. Phone calls with Harold became shorter and less frequent. Sunday family dinners, which had been our tradition since he returned from college, started getting canceled last minute. At first, it was once every couple of months, then monthly, then nearly every week. When they did come over, Stephanie often found reasons to cut the visits short. She would check her watch, mention other commitments, or sometimes even claim to feel suddenly ill. Harold either did not notice or chose not to address it, always making excuses for her behavior. I also began hearing from longtime employees that Harold was different at work, more secretive, less collaborative, more focused on quick profits than the long-term strategies we had always valued. Decisions were being made without my input, though I was still CEO. When I tried to discuss this with Harold, he would say things like, "We need to modernize our approach, Dad. The business world is different now." Looking back, I can see how Stephanie was slowly creating distance between us, working on Harold, changing his perspectives bit by bit. But at the time, I simply thought my son was growing into his own man, making his own decisions, even if I did not always agree with them. I tried to build bridges with Stephanie, invited her to lunch, asked about her interests, her family, but she maintained a polite wall of distance that I could never quite break through. Still, Harold was my son, my only family. I was determined to make this relationship work, for his sake. I told myself that with time, Stephanie would warm up to me. I just needed to be patient and understanding. How wrong I was. The third year of their marriage marked a significant turning point in our family dynamics. Stephanie had gradually taken over managing their social calendar, and somehow, I was included in fewer and fewer events. Birthday celebrations became couple getaways. Holidays that we had always spent together suddenly involved trips to destinations where unfortunately there was not enough room for everyone. I noticed Harold calling me from his car during commutes rather than from home. When I would call in the evenings, Stephanie would often answer and say Harold was busy or in the shower or had just stepped out. The calls became so predictable in their timing that I began to suspect Harold was only permitted to contact me during certain approved windows. One evening, Harold invited me to dinner without Stephanie. He seemed nervous, picking at his food and avoiding eye contact. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "Dad, I think it is time we discussed ownership shares of the company." I was taken aback. "What do you mean, Harold? You already own 30% of the company." He shifted uncomfortably. "Stephanie and I have been talking. With all the growth over the last few years, and with how much of that has been because of my contributions, we think 51% would be more appropriate." The company had indeed grown tremendously. Our valuation now stood at over $300 million, with offices in 8 countries. But this conversation felt wrong, forced somehow. "Harold, you know I have always planned for you to take over the company eventually. I am already 66. In a few years, I will be ready to step back. But right now, I am still active in the business, still developing new security protocols. A sudden shift in control does not make sense." His face hardened in a way I had never seen before. "Stephanie thinks you are holding on to control because you do not trust me." There it was. Not I think, but Stephanie thinks. I realized then that these were not his words or even necessarily his desires. "Son, this is not about trust. You will inherit everything eventually. The company, the house, everything. But business transitions need to be handled carefully. Let us develop a 5-year succession plan that makes sense." He left without finishing his meal, and for the first time, we did not hug goodbye. Over the next few months, tensions grew. Harold began challenging me in executive meetings, sometimes undermining decisions I had made. Several long-standing employees came to me privately expressing concern about the direction things were heading. I felt like I was losing both my son and the company I had built from nothing. I tried arranging another private dinner to clear the air, but Harold claimed he was too busy with work. The irony was painful, too busy with our company to discuss our relationship. Despite these personal complications, the business continued to thrive. We had just secured a major government contract that would increase our revenue by 40%. A critical meeting with partners in California was scheduled, and both Harold and I needed to attend. The night before the trip, Harold called. "Dad, I think it is better if I handle this meeting alone. The partners specifically requested to discuss the new security protocol you developed, but I have been briefed thoroughly. I can handle it." I was hurt but agreed. Perhaps some space would be good for us. Harold would take the company jet to California in the morning. I would use the time to think about how to repair our relationship. At 4:30 the next afternoon, my world collapsed. My assistant rushed into my office, face pale, eyes red. "Mr. Miller, there has been an accident. The company plane." Everything after that becomes a blur in my memory. The private jet had experienced catastrophic engine failure 15 minutes before landing in San Francisco. There were no survivors. Harold, my son, my only child, was gone. The pain was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Worse than losing my wife, because at least then I had Harold to live for. Now, I had no one. The emptiness was all-consuming. I could not eat, could not sleep. The house that once felt too quiet after Margaret died now felt like an echoing mausoleum. Stephanie's reaction to Harold's death was strange from the beginning. In public, at the funeral home, she was appropriately devastated, receiving condolences with tears streaming down her face. But twice I walked into rooms to find her calmly on her phone, dry-eyed and composed, only to collapse back into sobs when she noticed my presence. During those first few days, I was too consumed by my own grief to pay much attention. Looking back, there were so many signs I missed. The private calls she would take, stepping outside, the way she asked about company ownership and insurance policies while we were still making funeral arrangements, the coldness in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. I was lost in memories of Harold as a little boy, learning to ride his bike, graduating high school, joining me at the company. The future we had planned together was gone. All those dreams extinguished in an instant. The thought of continuing without him seemed impossible. How could I run our company alone? How could I face each day without my son? The one small comfort was knowing that Harold and I had at least built something lasting together. The company would stand as his legacy, and I would ensure it continued to thrive in his honor. Or so I thought at the time. I had no idea what Stephanie had planned. The funeral was held at St. Michael's Church, the same place where I had married Margaret 37 years earlier and where we had christened Harold. The church was filled beyond capacity. Employees, business partners, friends, and family all came to pay their respects. The collective grief was palpable, a physical presence in the air. I sat in the front row, feeling hollowed out. Stephanie sat beside me, a tissue perpetually pressed to her eyes. Throughout the service, she would occasionally reach over and squeeze my hand, a gesture that should have been comforting but somehow felt performative. When she spoke at the podium about her beloved husband and their beautiful life cut tragically short, her voice broke at all the right moments, but something about it rang false to me. Several of Harold's close friends spoke, sharing stories that made the congregation both laugh and cry. I was last to speak, and I could barely get through my prepared words. Looking out at the sea of faces, I realized how many lives my son had touched in his 34 years. The pride I felt momentarily overcame my grief, but the finality of putting him to rest crushed me anew as I returned to my seat. At the reception afterward, I noticed something odd. Stephanie had formed a small circle with 3 people I did not recognize. Their conversation seemed intense, with occasional glances in my direction. When I approached, they quickly dispersed, and Stephanie linked her arm through mine, steering me toward some distant relatives. "Who were those people?" I asked. "Just some friends from my yoga class," she replied smoothly. "They came to support me." Later, I overheard a snippet of conversation as I passed the men's room. A male voice I did not recognize said, "She said it is practically a done deal. Once the will is read." The voice trailed off as they noticed me walking by. I thought little of it at the time, consumed as I was with greeting mourners and accepting condolences. 3 days after the funeral, we gathered at the office of Joseph Reynolds, our family attorney and my friend of 30 years. Joseph had handled all our legal matters, both personal and professional, since I started the company. He was one of the few people who knew exactly how much Miller Innovations was worth, and all the details of our family finances. Stephanie arrived with her personal attorney, a sharp-featured man named Victor Kaplan, whom I had never met before. This surprised me, as there had never been any mention of her having separate legal representation, Joseph raised an eyebrow but said nothing as we all took seats in his wood-paneled conference room. "Thank you all for coming during this difficult time," Joseph began, his voice solemn. "We are here to read the last will and testament of Harold James Miller." He opened a folder and began reading the formal legal preamble. I barely listened, staring at a photograph of Joseph and me on his wall, taken on a fishing trip 15 years ago. Harold had been there too, a gangly teenager proudly holding up a smallmouth bass almost as big as his arm. My attention snapped back when I heard Joseph say, "To my wife, Stephanie Ann Miller, I leave our family home at 1242 Lakeshore Drive, along with all its contents and furnishings." Stephanie nodded slightly, as though this was expected. Joseph continued, "I also leave to Stephanie the sum of $55 million from my personal accounts and investments to provide for her comfort and security." I felt a small jolt of surprise. That was nearly all of Harold's liquid assets. But then, she was his wife, and I had always made it clear to Harold that everything I had would eventually be his. It made sense he would do the same for Stephanie. "To my father, William James Miller," Joseph read, looking at me over his glasses, "I leave my collection of vintage watches, my library of first edition books, and my gratitude for teaching me everything I know about business and life." I felt my throat tighten. The watches and books were meaningful keepsakes, certainly, but I had expected, well, I was not sure what I had expected. Perhaps some acknowledgement of our business partnership. "Regarding Miller Innovations," Joseph continued, and I sat up straighter. "Ownership shares will remain as currently distributed, with 55% belonging to William James Miller and 30% to the estate of Harold James Miller, now transferring to Stephanie Ann Miller. The remaining 15% stays with minor shareholders as previously established. So Stephanie would now own nearly a third of the company." That seemed reasonable, though I noticed she frowned slightly at this part. Joseph shuffled his papers. "There are additional provisions in the will that will be addressed at a later date, in accordance with Harold's specific instructions." At this, Victor Kaplan leaned forward. "What additional provisions?" "My client has a right to know all aspects of her inheritance immediately." Joseph smiled thinly. "Mr. Kaplan, I am following the explicit timeline instructions in the will. These provisions are sealed for 10 days following the initial reading, per Harold's specific request." "That is highly irregular," Kaplan protested. "Perhaps," Joseph conceded, "but completely legal and binding. You are welcome to review the documentation confirming this is indeed Harold's will, properly witnessed and notarized." Throughout this exchange, I noticed something odd about Joseph's demeanor. While professional as always, there was a gleam in his eye I could not quite place. Several times he looked at me as if wanting to communicate something, only to return his attention to the documents. As we prepared to leave, Joseph pulled me aside briefly. "Will, come see me privately in a week or so," he murmured. "There are matters we should discuss that are not for today." Before I could ask what he meant, Stephanie approached. Her expression transformed. The grief-stricken widow was gone, replaced by someone coolly appraising. She did not speak to me directly, instead turning to Joseph. "I will have my team begin the process of transferring the house deed and accounts immediately," she said. "Please have all necessary paperwork ready." Joseph nodded, that same strange look in his eyes. "Everything will be handled according to Harold's wishes, Mrs. Miller, every last detail." As we left the office, I tried to speak with Stephanie about arrangements for collecting Harold's personal effects, things that had sentimental value to me as his father. Items from his childhood, photographs, the model rockets we had built together. "We can discuss that later," she said dismissively. "I need some time to process everything and decide what to do with the house." I was surprised by her tone but attributed it to grief, manifesting in unexpected ways. I had no idea that within days, I would see a side of my daughter-in-law that would make me question everything I thought I knew about her relationship with my son. A week after the reading of the will, I drove to Harold and Stephanie's house. It was a sprawling 6-bedroom home on Lakeshore Drive with a stunning view of Lake Michigan. Harold and I had chosen the property together 3 years ago as a wedding present from me to the couple. Though technically the house had been in Harold's name, I had always felt welcome there, often joining them for dinners or helping Harold with his ambitious landscaping projects in the backyard. I carried a small box of Harold's childhood photographs I had found at my home, thinking Stephanie might want them. I also hoped we could talk about my taking some of Harold's personal items, particularly the collection of model trains we had built together over the years. They were displayed in what Harold had called his nostalgia room, along with other mementos from our lives. As I pulled into the circular driveway, I immediately noticed something had changed. The security keypad at the gate had been replaced with a newer model. I pressed the intercom button and waited. "Yes?" Stephanie's voice crackled through the speaker, though she could clearly see it was me through the camera. "Stephanie, it is Miller. I brought some photos of Harold I thought you might like to have." A long pause followed. "I am busy right now. I will not stay long," I promised. "Just wanted to drop these off and perhaps talk about a few of Harold's things." Another pause, then a sigh. "Fine, just for a minute." The gate swung open reluctantly. As I approached the front door, I noticed new security cameras had been installed there as well. Before I could ring the bell, the door opened. Stephanie stood there in expensive loungewear, her hair perfectly styled, showing no signs of the grieving widow she had portrayed at the funeral. "What do you want, Miller?" she asked coldly. Taken aback by her tone, I held up the box. "Like I said, just bringing these photographs. And I was hoping we could discuss which of Harold's personal items you might be comfortable with me taking. His trains, some books." She took the box without looking inside and placed it carelessly on a console table. "There is nothing to discuss. This is my house now. Everything in it belongs to me." I stepped into the foyer, noticing immediately that things had changed. The large photograph of Harold and me at the company's 20th anniversary celebration was gone from the wall. In fact, all pictures featuring me had been removed. "Stephanie, these are family heirlooms and personal items. Surely you do not object to me having some keepsakes of my son." Her expression hardened. "I have already begun cataloging everything for appraisal. Whatever has value will be sold. The rest will be donated or disposed of." "Sold?" I echoed, stunned. "Harold's collections, his memorabilia, these things are priceless to our family." "They have a price," she countered coldly. "Everything does." It was then I noticed movement from the direction of the kitchen. A man walked into view, tall with salt and pepper hair, casually dressed in what appeared to be a bathrobe. He froze when he saw me. "You should go, Miller," Stephanie said, positioning herself between me and the stranger. "You are not welcome here anymore." I could not believe what I was seeing. My son had been dead barely 2 weeks, and already she had someone else staying in their home, wearing Harold's robe. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice rising with emotion. "How dare you bring someone here so soon after Harold's death?" "My personal life is none of your concern," she snapped. "This is my house now, and I decide who comes and goes." "This was Harold's house too," I protested. "Our family home." "Not anymore," she said with a cruel smile. "And let me be perfectly clear so there is no misunderstanding. You are never to come here again. I have changed all the security codes and instructed the staff not to admit you under any circumstances." I stood there, speechless with shock and grief. The man had disappeared back into the kitchen, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. "But why?" I finally managed. "What have I ever done except love my son and try to welcome you into our family?" Her facade cracked then, revealing a glimpse of the real Stephanie beneath the polished exterior. "You were always watching me, judging me, thinking I was not good enough for your precious son. Harold was weak, always deferring to you, letting you control the company that should have been his. Well, now I have what I deserve, and you can leave with nothing, just like you wanted me to." "That is not true," I protested. "I never." "Save it," she cut me off. "I do not care what you think. You are nothing to me now. Harold is gone, and with him, any obligation I had to tolerate you." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You are not welcome here anymore. Go die in a dumpster for all I care." The raw hatred in her voice stunned me. This was not grief or stress talking. This was the real Stephanie, finally unmasked. "Now get out before I call security," she finished, holding the door open. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of the wall where Harold's portrait had hung. It had been replaced with a modern abstract painting. It was as if she were already erasing him from the home they had shared. I walked to my car in a daze, her cruel words echoing in my ears. Go die in a dumpster. How could she say such a thing to her husband's father? What had I ever done to deserve such hatred? Driving away from the house, I realized I had forgotten something important. Years ago, I had given Harold a voice recorder pen for taking notes in meetings. It was a habit he had picked up from me. I had been unconsciously clicking it in my pocket throughout our conversation, an old nervous tick. I now had a recording of Stephanie's entire venomous tirade. I moved into a small apartment near the company headquarters. Though I owned a perfectly nice house myself, I could not bear to be there surrounded by memories and empty rooms. The apartment was impersonal, sterile, but it suited my state of mind. News began filtering through that Stephanie was making inquiries about selling her shares in Miller Innovations. Several executives called me in a panic, worried about what would happen if 30% of the company suddenly went on the market. I assured them I was handling it, though truthfully, I had no idea what to do. Stephanie had also begun calling key clients, introducing herself as Harold's widow and the new significant shareholder. She suggested changes were coming to the company's leadership, creating uncertainty that threatened decades-old relationships. I felt as if I had lost everything. My son was gone. My legacy was at risk. Even my memories were being held hostage in a house I was banned from entering. For the first time in my life, I felt truly defeated. Then Joseph Reynolds called. "Will, we need to meet," Joseph said over the phone, his voice unusually urgent. "Not at my office. Somewhere private." We arranged to meet at a small coffee shop in a suburb north of Chicago, far from both our usual haunts. When I arrived, Joseph was already seated in a back corner, 2 coffees on the table and a slim briefcase beside him. "Thank you for coming," he said, pushing one of the coffees toward me. He looked around carefully before continuing in a lowered voice. "There are things about Harold's will that I could not reveal at the reading. Things Harold specifically instructed were to be kept confidential until certain conditions were met." "What conditions?" I asked, confused. Joseph leaned forward. "Harold came to me about 8 months ago, Will. He was troubled. He would not go into specific details, but said he had concerns about Stephanie's motivations and what might happen to you if anything ever happened to him." I felt a chill. 8 months ago? Yes. He asked me to draft special provisions into his will, provisions that would only be revealed after a specific waiting period following his death. That period expires tomorrow. Joseph opened his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. This contains the addendum to Harold's will that was not read at the initial meeting. Essentially, it states that Stephanie's inheritance, both the house and the $55 million, is contingent upon her behavior toward you during the first 10 days after the will reading. I stared at him, trying to process this. Contingent how? The will stipulates that if Stephanie treats you with respect and kindness during this period, maintaining family harmony and honoring Harold's wishes regarding family keepsakes and memories, then her inheritance stands as read. He paused, eyes meeting mine. However, if she behaves in a manner that demonstrates disrespect, cruelty, or attempts to exclude you from family properties or possessions, then the entire inheritance reverts to you, with Stephanie receiving a one-time payment of $100,000 only. My mind reeled. Harold had suspected something like this might happen. Had he known Stephanie better than I realized? Harold added that if you were prevented from accessing the family home or denied any of his personal effects with sentimental value, this would automatically trigger the reversal clause. Joseph continued. "But how would we prove how she has behaved?" I asked. Joseph shrugged. That was the one weakness in the plan. Harold said you would need to document any mistreatment. Without evidence, it becomes your word against hers. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the pen. "Will this help?" "It is a recording device. I accidentally captured my entire interaction with Stephanie at the house yesterday, including her telling me to go die in a dumpster and banning me from the property." Joseph's eyebrows shot up. Then, unexpectedly, he began to laugh. "Harold always said you carried one of these everywhere. Like father, like son." He took the pen carefully. This changes everything. May I? He pressed play, and Stephanie's cold voice filled the quiet corner of the cafe. As the recording continued, Joseph's expression grew increasingly satisfied. When it finished, he looked up at me with that strange gleam I had noticed during the will reading. "Did you listen carefully to the will?" he asked, still smiling. "There is more. More than her losing the inheritance?" I asked, confused. "Will," Harold suspected Stephanie might try to sell her shares in the company if she inherited them. He was worried about what that would do to the business and to you. So he added another clause. Joseph extracted a second document from his briefcase. This stipulates that in the event the reversal clause is triggered, not only does the house and money revert to you, but Stephanie's inherited 30% stake in Miller Innovations also transfers to you, consolidating your ownership to 85%. I felt like the air had been punched out of my lungs. Harold did all this to protect me? To protect the company? Joseph nodded solemnly. He loved you, Will. He may have been influenced by Stephanie in many ways, but in the end, he made sure you and the legacy you built together would be protected. When did he add these provisions? I asked. The final changes were made just 3 weeks before the accident. It was the last time I saw him. Joseph's voice softened. He seemed troubled. Will said he had discovered something that changed everything, but he needed time to figure out how to handle it. I wonder if he had begun to see through Stephanie. I thought back to those final weeks, how distracted Harold had seemed. The way he would start to tell me something, then change the subject. Had he discovered something about Stephanie? Something that made him doubt her? "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now," Joseph said, gathering his documents, "we invite Stephanie to my office tomorrow for what she will think is the finalization of her inheritance. And then we spring the trap that Harold designed to protect everything he truly cared about." As I left the cafe, I felt something I had not experienced since Harold's death. A sense of connection to my son. Even from beyond the grave, he had found a way to look out for me, just as I had always tried to look out for him. Joseph's office the next morning felt charged with anticipation. I arrived early at his request, and we went over the plan one final time. The recording had been transferred to Joseph's computer, ready to play at the crucial moment. The sealed portion of Harold's will was prepared for formal reading. "Remember," Joseph said quietly as we heard the receptionist announce Stephanie's arrival, "let me handle the legal aspects. Try to stay calm no matter what happens." Stephanie swept in with her attorney, Victor Kaplan, in tow. She wore an expensively tailored black dress that suggested continued mourning for public appearances, though her expression held nothing but cool confidence. "Good morning," Joseph greeted them professionally. "Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." "Let us keep this brief," Stephanie replied, settling into a chair. "I have a realtor meeting me at the house in 2 hours to discuss listing options." I felt a stab of pain at how quickly she planned to sell the home Harold had loved, but kept my expression neutral as Joseph had advised. "Listing options?" Joseph inquired innocently. "You are planning to sell the Lakeshore property?" "Of course," she said dismissively. "It is far too large for just me, and frankly, I prefer Miami. I will be relocating as soon as the Chicago house sells." Joseph nodded thoughtfully. "And the contents of the house? Mr. Miller mentioned you were planning to sell Harold's collections as well?" "Whatever has market value," she confirmed, glancing at me with thinly veiled contempt. "The rest will be donated for the tax write-off." "I see," Joseph said. He opened a folder on his desk. "Well, before you proceed with those plans, there is a final portion of Harold's will that must be addressed. As I mentioned during our first meeting, Harold included provisions that were to be revealed 10 days after the initial reading. Today marks that deadline." Kaplan leaned forward. "My client has already been informed of her inheritance. The house and $55 million, plus 30% of Miller Innovations. That was indeed the preliminary bequest," Joseph agreed. "However, Harold included conditional terms that could modify that inheritance based on certain behaviors during the 10-day waiting period." Stephanie's confident smile faltered slightly. "What are you talking about? What conditions?" Joseph began reading from the document. "I, Harold James Miller, being of sound mind, hereby declare that the bequests to my wife, Stephanie Ann Miller, are contingent upon her demonstration of respect and kindness toward my father, William James Miller. During the 10-day period following the initial reading of this will, Stephanie's face drained of color. Beside her, Kaplan shifted uncomfortably. "The will continues," Joseph went on, voice steady and professional. "If Stephanie restricts my father's access to our family home, prevents him from collecting personal items of sentimental value, or treats him with disrespect during this period, all bequests to her shall be nullified." "This is ridiculous," Stephanie interrupted, her voice rising. "You cannot enforce something so subjective. This will would never hold up in court." Joseph continued as if she had not spoken. "In the event these conditions are violated, all bequests originally designated for Stephanie Ann Miller shall revert to my father, William James Miller, with the exception of a one-time payment of $100,000 to Stephanie." "Objection," Kaplan sputtered, falling into courtroom language in his agitation. "This is highly irregular and almost certainly contestable. Where is the proof of any alleged mistreatment?" Joseph smiled thinly and turned to his computer. "I believe Mr. Miller can address that question." All eyes turned to me. I cleared my throat. "Yesterday, I visited the Lake Shore house to bring Stephanie some family photographs and to discuss collecting some of Harold's personal items with sentimental value. This is what happened." Joseph pressed play, and the recording began. Stephanie's voice filled the room, cold and clear. "This is my house now. Everything in it belongs to me." As the recording continued, her face went from pale to crimson. By the time it reached, "You are not welcome here anymore. Go die in a dumpster for all I care." She was gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles had turned white. When the recording ended, silence filled the room. "That is taken out of context," she finally stammered. "I was emotional, grieving. The recording clearly captures your ban on Mr. Miller entering the family home and your refusal to allow him to collect items of sentimental value," Joseph noted calmly. "Both actions specifically trigger the reversal clause in Harold's will." "You set me up," she accused, turning to me with venom in her eyes. "No, Stephanie," I replied quietly. "You revealed who you really are. The recording was accidental, but your words and actions were deliberate." Joseph returned to the document. "There is a further provision regarding Miller Innovations. In the event the reversal clause is triggered, the 30% ownership stake that would have transferred to Stephanie also reverts to William Miller, bringing his total ownership to 85%. Stephanie's attorney leaned over to whisper urgently in her ear. Her eyes widened, and suddenly, without warning, she slumped in her chair, having apparently fainted. There was a flurry of activity as Kaplan called her name, and Joseph rushed to get water. I remained seated, watching as Stephanie's eyes fluttered open almost immediately. Too immediately, I thought. This too was a performance. "I do not feel well," she murmured, pressing a hand to her forehead dramatically. "This is too much. Will, surely you do not intend to leave me with nothing, after I made Harold so happy?" The sudden shift to using my first name and appealing to my better nature was jarring but predictable. When threats failed, try manipulation. "The will provides you with $100,000, I reminded her. "Hardly nothing." She sat up straighter, dropping the fragile act. "That is insulting. I was his wife. For less than 5 years, I pointed out, during which time you systematically worked to separate him from his family and, apparently, had already moved another man into your home within 2 weeks of his death." Her eyes narrowed. "You have no proof of anything inappropriate. The man in Harold's bathrobe was inappropriate enough," I replied. "But actually, I have more than you realize." I nodded to Joseph, who produced another document. Following Harold's instructions, Joseph explained, "I hired a private investigator 3 months ago. Harold suspected Stephanie was being unfaithful. The investigator documented her relationship with Gregory Vance, who happens to be a VP at Nexus Technologies, one of our primary competitors." Stephanie's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. "Harold discovered your infidelity shortly before his death, Stephanie. It broke his heart, but it also opened his eyes. That is why he changed his will, why he built in these protections." "You are bluffing," she managed finally. Joseph slid a manila envelope across the table. "The full investigative report. Time-stamped photographs, hotel receipts, text message transcripts. Harold knew everything. Stephanie grabbed the envelope and rifled through its contents, her face growing paler by the second. "This cannot be legal," she insisted, turning to her attorney. "Victor, tell them they cannot do this." Kaplan, having skimmed the key portions of the will addendum, looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Miss Harrington," he began, reverting to her maiden name and what seemed a telling slip. "The conditions appear to be legally binding. With the evidence presented, I would advise considering a settlement rather than a costly court challenge that public records suggest you are unlikely to win." "You are fired," she spat, standing abruptly. "I will find someone who actually knows how to do their job." "Before you go," Joseph interjected calmly, "there are several documents requiring your signature to formalize the transfer of assets back to Mr. Miller. Unless you prefer we handle this through the courts, which would necessarily involve making all of this evidence part of the public record." The threat of public exposure seemed to finally penetrate Stephanie's anger. Her shoulders slumped slightly. "Fine," she said through clenched teeth. "Give me the papers." As she signed each document with sharp, angry strokes, I felt no joy or triumph, only a profound sadness for what could have been. Harold had deserved so much better. When she finished, she stood and faced me. For a moment, I thought I glimpsed genuine emotion in her eyes, perhaps even regret, but it passed quickly, replaced by cold fury. "You will regret this," she said quietly. "I already regret many things," I replied. "Mainly that I did not see who you really were before you hurt my son." She gathered her purse and turned to leave, then paused at the door. "He never loved you as much as you think, you know. He was planning to push you out of the company entirely. That was his idea, not mine." Her final attempt to wound me fell flat. The evidence of Harold's true feelings was in the will he had crafted to protect me, in the precautions he had taken to preserve our shared legacy. "Goodbye, Stephanie," I said simply. As the door closed behind her, Joseph looked at me. "Are you all right, Will?" I nodded slowly. Harold saw through her in the end. "That brings me some peace." "He did more than see through her," Joseph replied. "He outmaneuvered her completely. You raised a smart son, Will. He learned from the best." For the first time since Harold's death, I felt a small smile form. "Yes," I agreed. "Yes, he did." The weeks following Stephanie's departure from our lives were filled with both grief and healing. Reclaiming Harold's home was bittersweet. Every room held memories, echoes of laughter, conversations, shared dreams. The first night I stayed there, I sat in Harold's study, surrounded by his books and awards, feeling both his absence and his presence intensely. I found his personal journal in the desk drawer, and with trembling hands, I read his final entries. The discovery of Stephanie's betrayal had devastated him. He had written about seeing text messages on her phone while she showered, learning of her relationship with Gregory Vance, realizing she had been feeding information about our security protocols to a competitor through her lover. "I do not know who she really is," he had written. "Everything feels like a lie. Dad tried to warn me in his gentle way, but I would not listen. I need to fix this. Protect the company. Protect Dad. He has always protected me. Now it is my turn." The journal revealed that Harold had been planning to confront Stephanie after returning from the California trip. He had already consulted with Joseph about divorce proceedings. He never got that chance. Going through the house, I discovered more evidence of Stephanie's true character. Hidden in a locked drawer were documents showing she had been transferring small sums from Harold's personal accounts to a private offshore account for years. I found photographs of Harold, edited to remove me from family occasions. Most disturbing, I discovered a dossier on Nexus Technologies that could only have come from their internal servers, suggesting her relationship with Gregory Vance had always been about corporate espionage. I turned all evidence over to our legal team, who pursued industrial espionage charges against both Stephanie and Vance. Nexus Technologies, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, fired Vance immediately and entered into a settlement agreement with us that included significant financial compensation. Stephanie, last I heard, had moved to Miami as planned, but without the millions she had expected. The $100,000 from Harold's will would not support her accustomed lifestyle for long. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only sadness for the pain she had caused my son in his final months. At Miller Innovations, I implemented the succession plan Harold and I had discussed before tensions arose. I appointed 2 promising executives as co-presidents, with myself as chairman of the board, gradually stepping back from day-to-day operations while ensuring the company remained true to our founding principles. In Harold's memory, I established the Harold Miller Foundation for Young Entrepreneurs, providing scholarships and mentoring to students with innovative ideas but limited resources. It was the kind of program Harold had always talked about creating someday. Now it would be his legacy. The most difficult part of healing was accepting that I had missed the signs of Stephanie's manipulation. I had seen the red flags but dismissed them out of respect for Harold's choices. I wondered if I could have prevented the pain she caused him had I been more direct, more willing to risk his displeasure by voicing my concerns forcefully. A grief counselor helped me understand that Stephanie was a particularly skilled manipulator who had fooled many people, including Harold himself, for years. Self-blame would not bring my son back or honor his memory. Slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild my life. I reconnected with old friends I had neglected, joined a support group for parents who had lost children, even began dating again almost a year after Harold's death, something I never thought I would do. The company continued to thrive, and I made sure every employee knew their jobs were secure. Many told me they stayed because of the respect they had for both Harold and me, for the ethical company we had built together. That meant more to me than any profit margin. Today, 2 years after losing Harold, I still feel the ache of his absence daily, but I also feel profound gratitude for the son who protected me even after he was gone. His foresight, his care, his determination to right the wrongs in his life even as he discovered them, fill me with pride. Life teaches us lessons in painful ways sometimes. I learned that true love does not isolate you from others who care about you. I learned that we must trust our instincts when something feels wrong, even when we cannot immediately identify why. Most importantly, I learned that what we build in life, whether companies or relationships, must be founded on honesty and integrity to truly last. Harold's final gift to me was not the company or the house or the financial security. It was the chance to see justice done, to protect what we had built together, and to move forward knowing that in the end, he had seen the truth and acted on it with courage and wisdom. In the end, my son protected me even after he was gone. I wonder if somehow he knew, not about his death, but about the darkness that can hide behind a beautiful smile. Trust your instincts, and remember that true love never demands that you abandon those who have always loved you. If this story resonated with you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Have you ever had your instincts about someone proven right after dismissing them? What were the signs you noticed but ignored? Drop a comment below to share your experience. Do not forget to subscribe for more stories about family, betrayal, and unexpected justice. And remember, sometimes the people who are no longer with us find ways to protect us still. Thank you for listening, and may you always recognize true love from false.